Chapter 3 The New Men. In early August 1846, an event occurred that would forever change the lives of the Navajo people. The U.S. Army, led by Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny, entered Santa Fe. The United States had just fought a one-sided war with Mexico. The territory of New Mexico now became part of the United States by right of conquest. On August 18, General Kearny officially declared control over the citizens of New Mexico, including all the Indian tribes within the territory. The Navajos called the Americans the New Men. They hoped to find a peaceful way to exist with them. Had the Americans tried to understand the Navajos, things may have gone very differently. However, the established U.S. policy of dealing with Indians was built not on understanding, but on treaties favorable to the United States and on the use of military power to enforce those agreements. If white settlers wanted Indian land, then the Indians would be removed. Even after coming of the Americans, the New Mexicans continued to raid Navajo rancherias for slaves. Navajo children could be sold for as much as $200 each, and it was very common for a New Mexican to own several Navajo slaves. When the Navajos complained to the Americans and asked that their people be freed from slavery, nothing was done. But when the New Mexicans complained of the Navajo raids, the U.S. Army quickly took the field against the Indians. Like the Spanish and the New Mexicans, the Americans also failed to understand that the Navajos were not a single nation with one chief who could speak for everyone. Instead, the Navajos consisted of many bands, each with its own headman. An agreement with one headman was not binding on all Navajos. Over the next 16 years, a number of treaties were made between the United States and Navajo headmen. The first of these was the Treaty of Ojo del Oso, signed on October 22, 1846. An elderly and influential headman named Narbona had spoke strongly for peace, so about 500 Navajos came to the grassy valley of Ojo del Oso, which had natural springs that were held sacred by the Navajos. At the meeting, the American in charge, Colonel Alexander W. Doniphan, told the Navajos that if they did not stop the raids, the United States would make war on them. The Navajos thought this was a strange demand. The Americans were fighting a war against other Americans who held slaves. Should not the new men be the Navajos' allies against the New Mexican slave raiders? Zarquios Largos, another Navajo headman, spoke for his people. Americans, you have a strange cause for war against the Navajos. We have waged war against the New Mexicans for many years. We have plundered their villages and killed many of their people. You have lately commenced a war against the same people. You are powerful, you have great guns and many brave soldiers. You have therefore conquered them, the very same thing we have been attempting to do for so many years. You now turn upon us for attempting what you have done yourselves. We cannot see why you have cause to quarrel with us for fighting the New Mexicans on the west, while you do the same on the east. Despite his uncertainty, Zarquios Largos and 10 other Navajo headmen signed the first peace treaty between the United States and the Navajo people. Unfortunately, the trade in Navajo slaves did not cease. If anything, it increased in the years that followed. 3 years later, Narbona attended another treaty-making party with a party of New Mexican volunteers and American soldiers. It took place at Washington Pass on the North Fork of Tunucha Creek near the present-day Two Gray Hills trading post. Narbona was now well over 80 years old, but his people still listened to him, and when he urged them to live in peace, Colonel J. M. Washington was discussing the proposed treaty with the old men when a New Mexican accused one of the Navajos of riding a horse that he had stolen from him. The soldiers immediately tried to seize the Navajo. When he and his friends tried to escape, the soldiers opened fire on all of the Navajos. 6 Navajos were killed, including Narbona, whose long white hair was ripped from his head by the New Mexican scalp hunter. A few Navajos eventually signed the Treaty of Washington Pass, but the murder of Narbona had killed any chance for a meaningful peace agreement. Even though they now distrusted the Americans, many Navajos still tried to find ways to live with them in peace. It was hard for the Americans to decide on a firm policy for dealing with the Indians because the Indian agents and governors in Santa Fe changed so rapidly. The best of the many Indian agents was a man named Henry L. Dodge, appointed in May of 1853. He was the first agent to actually live among the Navajos. He always treated them with respect and honesty and tried to act in their best interest. He hired a blacksmith and a silversmith to teach new and useful trades to the Navajos, who quickly became creative metal workers, transforming silver coins into necklaces and other jewelry. The Navajos grew to love Dodge during his 2 years in office. They called him Red Shirt for the red flannel shirts he always wore. Had Dodge remained as Indian agent, the later wars between the United States and the Navajos might never have happened. But in 1855, while he was out hunting deer with a group of Navajo friends, he became separated from the others and was killed by a party of Apaches. The Navajos were not blamed for Dodge's death, but they had lost their best advocate. More treaties were signed, taking the best land for grazing away from the Navajos and making it hard for them to maintain their herds. Forts were built or reinforced to keep the Navajos out of the lands that they had always been theirs. In the summer of 1858, because of a severe drought, the Navajos returned their herds to some of that land near Fort Defiance. When soldiers from the fort found the animals grazing there, they opened fire, killing about 48 cattle that belonged to a Navajo headman named Manuelito. Many Navajos now felt certain that unless they went on raids for food, they would starve. The hostilities that followed were ended by the Bonneville Treaty of December 1858. This treaty, however, was meant to punish the Navajos, and it took away even more of their land. Finally, the Navajos could stand it no longer. In 1860, a large force of Navajos, led by Manuelito, attacked Fort Defiance in an attempt to reclaim traditional grazing lands. Although the attack failed, the army recognized how desperate the Navajos had become. Colonel Edward S. Canby, who had led the recent campaign, convinced 47 headmen to sign a treaty. The Canby Treaty of 1861 led to the new approach to encourage the Navajos to stop raiding. In February of 1861, the army began a successful policy of issuing rations to the Navajos at places such as Fort Fauntleroy. In April of that same year, the American Civil War began. Although that conflict was between the Americans of the North and the South, it would soon deeply involve the Navajos and bring about the most tragic events in their history. The brief truce that had brought peace to the canyons of Dinnitah would soon be broken by the thunder of white man's guns. Chapter 4. The Fearing Time. The New Mexico Territory was in the path of the Southern Army moving north and west from Texas to take control of the gold fields in California. The American soldiers, among them a former mountain man named Kit Carson, were pulled from the forts to meet the Confederate threat. It meant to end the policy of providing rations to the hungry Navajos. Before long, many Navajos felt they had no choice but to return to raiding to survive. The Confederate plan failed. The Southern forces were defeated at Glorieta Pass, and the threat of invasion ended. General James H. Carleton, the new military commander of the New Mexico Territory, looked around for a new enemy. He decided on the Navajos and the Apaches. The Mexicans told him that the Indians were lawless raiders, like so many others before him. He did not listen to the native side of the story. He decided to crush them in battle and then remove them from their lands. Carleton knew just the man to lead his campaign, Kit Carson, who was now a colonel. The Navajos called him Red Clothes, or rope thrower. Carson had a reputation as an Indian fighter. Carleton sent him first against the Mescalero Apaches, who numbered fewer than the Navajos. Within a few months, by constantly pursuing the Mescalero and burning their homes and crops, Carson had defeated them. The Mescaleros were shipped to a place known as the Bosque Redondo, or Round Grove. Despite its name, which came from the cottonwood trees scattered along the Pecos River, it was a barren place in the salt flats of eastern New Mexico. A new military outpost named Fort Sumner was built there to guard the Indian prisoners. The location was Carleton's choice, even though there was poor water, little firewood, and bad soil. Others in the military tried to change his mind, arguing that the site was not the best choice. Carleton was adamant. He would make the Bosque Redondo a model reservation, his own fair Carrolltonia. It was there that Carleton planned to send the Navajos. The Navajos tried to talk with Carleton. A delegation of 18 headmen led by Barboncito and Delgadito, two well-known and respected Navajo leaders, tried to arrange a truce. General Carleton refused to talk to them. "We have no faith in their promises," Carleton said, ignoring the fact that little, if any, promise-breaking had been done by the Navajos. In 1863, using Indians for his scouts, Kit Carson took the field against the Navajos. The Utes were traditional enemies of the Navajo and often captured Navajos to sell. Carson suggested that part of the Utes' payment could be Navajo slaves. The time the Navajos called the fearing time had begun. General Carleton issued his brutal orders to Kit Carson. "Say to them, 'Go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue and destroy you. We will not make peace with you or on any other terms.'" Carson was to pursue them, not with the large army, but with small parties moving stealthily to their haunts until they could fight no more. Carleton did not hate the Navajos, but he also did not seem to view them as human beings. "An Indian," he wrote, "is more watchful and wary an animal than a deer. He must be hunted with skill." Once again the Navajos sent a delegation pleading for peace. "Only a few of us have raided," they said. "Most of us are peaceful people. We have not broken the treaties." As before, they were ignored. As the military campaign continued, any Navajos found by the army were shot on sight unless they immediately surrendered. Many stories about that time of being hunted by the white soldiers and their Indian scouts are still remembered by the Navajos. One tells of a man who escaped the army by jumping off a high cliff. His fall was broken by bushes and treetops below, and he escaped unharmed. Most Navajos did not understand why they were being rounded up. Some thought they were being removed so that the white people could have their land. Others heard that they were being taken to a place where they would all be put to death. Although some Navajos never were caught seeking refuge in such rough areas as the lands around Navajo Mountain, most of the people had no other choice. They could starve, be shot, or be taken as slaves, or they could surrender to the army. With dignity and great sorrow, Delgadito led 200 members of his band in to surrender in 1863. Other headmen followed as Carson's campaign became more intense. Carson's army were cutting through the heart of Dinnitah like a sharp blade through corn. All of the Navajos' old enemies were against them. There was no place to hide. Even Canyon de Chelly was not safe. Note: following pages, sacred corn pollen, symbol of the new generation, is trampled by horses' hooves as soldiers storm Canyon de Chelly. The lightning suggests harmony being destroyed. Chantal Biguet. In January 1864, Carson marched into the ancient refuge, and the people fled. The hogans in the canyon were burned, and thousands of peach trees they had lovingly tended were cut down. Desperate, hungry Navajo families now flocked to newly named Fort Canby, which originally had been called Fort Defiance, and which would revert to its old name again after 1864. The weak and suffering Navajos were then taken to Fort Canby to the staging area at Fort Wingate. From there, a long column of Navajo prisoners would be forced to walk east toward Fort Sumner under a harsh military escort. Even Manuelito, the great war leader who had planned the attack on Fort Defiance, eventually came in with his people, though he did not do so until 1866. Soon the staging areas at the forts held as many Indians as they could handle. The military campaign against the Navajos ended, but the terrible ordeal was not over yet. The long walk east to Fort Sumner and the Bosque Redondo was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Walk Itself. It is more than 470 hard miles from Fort Canby to Fort Sumner. This is a distance that was walked by all the Navajos who were driven from their homeland. Today, U.S. Interstate Route 40 follows the same trail the struggling Navajos were forced to march upon. It runs past Gallup, New Mexico, over the dark lava flow said to be the blood of a monster killed long ago by the Navajo hero twins. It leads below the cliffs and mesas of Acoma and Laguna, where the Pueblo people watch the long lines of Navajos trudging warily past. It passes under the shade of the great Sandia Crest near Albuquerque, and then rolls across the land that is drier and flatter and more barren with each mile. This was the trail that brought the suffering people closer to their destination. It is a journey that, in a car today, is by turns strikingly picturesque and then monotonous. Neither of these words, however, can describe the experience it was for the suffering Navajos. There was, in fact, more than one long walk. Parties of Navajos of various sizes set out from Fort Canby and Fort Wingate over a 3-year period. Even before the Long Walk began in 1864, about 200 Navajo forced immigrants were led to the Bosque Redondo by the headman Delgadito in November of 1863. Later parties would be much larger. At first, all of the captive Navajos were forced to make a long detour off the route to Santa Fe, 60 miles north. It was Carleton's orders that the once feared Navajos should be paraded down the narrow, winding streets of the capital city to be displayed to the citizens as helpless, defeated prisoners. Later in 1864, when the number of Navajos grew too large, this detour to Santa Fe was abandoned. For a time, though, no one knows why the route detoured 70 miles further north to Fort Union. Although the army had orders to use wagons, horses, and mules to help carry the sick, the children, and the crippled, they were seldom used for this purpose. The soldiers rode and the Indians walked. Anyone too weak or too ill to keep up would be shot or left behind. The late Howard Gorman, a deeply respected elder whose ancestors made this terrible journey, told a story passed down by his elders. Following pages, images of a forced relocation, the cries of children, moans of the dying, futile prayers uttered in the snow and mud along a blood-soaked trail, were emotionally difficult to recreate. Chantal Biguet. Somewhere near Butterfly Mountain south of Albuquerque, a young woman who was about to give birth could keep up no longer. Her relatives begged the soldiers to wait for her. They were forced to move on. One soldier rode back. Then the sound of a gunshot was heard. Some of the column of Navajos stretched for 5 miles across the wide land. They could average no more than 10 or 12 miles a day, and the weather was often harsh as they traveled. They slept outside with no shelter or blankets. Some had livestock that they drove along with them, but Indian raiders and New Mexican slavers attacked the columns, driving off animals and taking prisoners. The Navajos were not well fed, and the food they were given was something strange to them. At Fort Canby, where they were held before setting out, they were given coffee beans. The Navajos, who thought they were like pinto beans, boiled the coffee beans and tried to eat them. Given white flour rather than cornmeal they were used to, the Navajos tried to eat it raw or mix it with water to make a thin soup. As a result, they became sick. Between February 20th and March 6, 1864, 126 Navajos died of dysentery at Fort Canby. Perhaps the most tragic long walks was the one that began on March 4, 1864, with 2,150 Navajos. It was the largest group to set out, and the number increased to more than 2,500 as they traveled. Though they were weakened by their encampment at Fort Canby and harried along the march by New Mexican raiders, their worst enemy would prove to be weather. General Carleton himself made note of it, writing, "The weather was very inclement, with terrible gales of wind and heavy snow. The Indians were nearly naked, and besides, many died from dysentery occasioned from eating too heartily of half-cooked bread made from our flour, to which they were unaccustomed. Perhaps 1 in every 10 of the people who set on that trip died along the way, their frozen bodies marking the trail. As the roundup of Navajos continued, it became clear to General Carleton that he had miscalculated. Carleton had originally estimated there were no more than 8,000 Navajos, but by November 1864, 8,750 men, women, and children were counted at Fort Sumner. Ironically, this number included even the enemy Navajos, who had long fought their own people and had allied themselves with the New Mexicans. In Carleton's eyes, it did not matter that any one time they had helped the army. All that mattered was that they were Navajos. However, so many hungry and poor people, the largest concentration of Indians in the North American continent, stretched the resources of the army to the breaking point. There was not enough food or necessities at Fort Sumner. No more Indians could be brought by the army to Bosque Redondo. The long walks ended. Military operations out of Fort Wingate against the Navajos ended in the spring and summer of 1865. As a result, several thousand Navajos remained in their homeland, hiding in the most desolate places from armed New Mexicans who had been urged by General Carleton to kill all the Navajo men who ran away from the Bosque or who will not go there. Meanwhile, the Navajos who were now held at Bosque wondered how they would survive. They called their place of captivity Huelde, from the Spanish word fuerte, meaning strong place. Some Navajos said it meant place of the wind, for only the wind, which did not need to eat or drink, could live there. Chapter 6. The Bosque Redondo. Like many of the military men of his time, General Carleton believed it was his job to kill the Indian and save the man. By giving them civilization, he would make life better for the Navajos. Thus, life for his Indians at the Bosque Redondo was supposed to be a paradise on earth. But that paradise existed only in Carleton's mind. Ignoring the hard facts that faced him, he sent back glowing reports of life at fair Carrolltonia. It was a place where the Apache and Navajo prisoners would be weaned from their old ways. There, as Carleton wrote, the army will be kind to them. There teach their children to read and write, teach them the arts of peace. Soon they would acquire new habits, new ideas, new modes of life. The old Indians would die off and carry with them all the latent longings for murdering and robbing. From the very start, Carrolltonia was a dismal failure. The reservation was 40 miles by 40 miles. It was based on Carleton's very poorly thought out recommendations and was established by an order from President Abraham Lincoln on January 15, 1864. The very fact that 400 Mescalero Apaches and more than 8,000 Navajos were confined to a single reservation was itself a mistake. Though cousins, the two native nations had fought each other in the past, and they resented being forced to share the same reservation. Eventually, the entire Mescalero Apache population escaped from the Bosque, leaving the Navajos behind. The Bosque, Carleton had written in 1863, was the best pastoral region between the two oceans. Within 10 years, the Navajos would be the happiest and most delightfully located pueblo of Indians in New Mexico, perhaps in the United States. It soon became evident to everyone except the general that his plan to make Bosque Redondo a garden spot was doomed. The first year's crop planted in the dry alkaline soil and weakened by a severe winter failed. The second year's corn crop also failed, as did the third and the fourth. Carleton persisted, ordering the Navajos to work in the fields even when the weather was extremely bad. In February of 1865, 100 Navajos forced to plow the fields in the midst of the blizzard froze to death. Note: this is unverified at this time. Unnote. Carleton tried to make the Navajos live in one single Pueblo-style village. The Navajos refused. They preferred the old ways of separating into smaller bands and following their own headmen. Carleton finally gave in. He was the first American military leader to accept what the Navajos had told everyone all along. They were not one unified tribe, but a number of bands, each with its own headman. The general appointed Kit Carson to help set up 10 separate towns on the Bosque, each with its own headman. But even this reorganization on something like a traditional model was not enough to really help the lives of the Navajos, who were held prisoner there. The rations were hardly ever enough for the people. The army had bought additional supplies from civilian contractors, but the food sent to the Indians was often spoiled or contaminated with rat droppings. There was little firewood. Although the army forced the Navajos to build barracks for the soldiers, the Indians lived first in holes they dug in the ground, and then in rough hogans made of brush and mud and whatever else they could find. What few livestock the Navajos had managed to keep were not safe. The Kiowas and Comanches made regular raids on the Bosque, striking so swiftly that the soldiers in the fort could seldom respond in time. The Navajos could not understand why they were being punished this way. As Howard Gorman explained in Navajo Stories of the Long Walk period, they said among themselves, "What did we do wrong? We people here didn't do any harm. The ones that were doing all the killing and raiding of the white men probably are still doing the same thing back home. We harmless people are held here, and we want to go back to our homes right away. I can feel cold chill in the bones of these battered and subdued people living on the brink of non-existence. Their faith gives them strength to endure." Shanto Begay. Soon, Navajos began to follow the lead of the Apaches and slip away from Huelte. Carleton issued orders that any Navajo caught away from the reservation without one of the metal passes made by the fort's blacksmiths would be shot. Before long, counterfeit metal passes made by Navajo metal workers were more common than the real ones. By 1865, large numbers of Navajos were escaping from the reservation and making their way back to Dineta. Some were raiding the ranches near Fort Sumner or striking back against the Comanches and Kiowa. Meanwhile, the army was finding it harder and harder to feed and care for its unwilling charges. The 40 miles square of the Bosque Redondo held not only the largest single concentration of Indians in the United States, but also the unhappiest. Chapter 7. The Walk Home. Life for the Navajos at Bosque Redondo grew worse every year. They only received food every other day. The medicines given them were bad, the blankets so poorly made that the Navajo women unraveled them to weave them again. There was so little firewood that everyone was always cold. Their small herds of livestock continued to decline. By 1865, General Carleton was asking the Indian Service of the Department of the Interior to take over the reservation. The army was not being given enough money by Congress to take care of the almost 8,000 Navajos who still remained at the Bosque. The superintendent of Indian Affairs refused. The army had rounded up the Navajos and placed them at Fort Sumner. It was the army's job to take care of them. Word of the awful conditions at Bosque spread. The American Civil War, which would end in May 1865, was drawing to a close. Congress was now free to turn its attention to the plight of the Navajos. It was vitally important to find solutions for the various conflicts between American settlers and the Western Indians whose lands they were occupying. The plight of the Navajos at the Bosque Redondo became a much publicized controversy. In June 1865, a congressional delegation, the Doolittle Committee, held hearings at Fort Sumner. One of those questioned was the Navajo headman Herrero. The soldiers about here treat us very bad," he said, "whipping and kicking us." The congressman listened to the Navajos. For the first time, the real cause of the Navajo wars, the generations of slave raids against the Indians, was discovered. Despite these findings, no real action was taken to help the Navajos at the Bosque. However, public and congressional opposition to General Carleton's dictatorial rule increased. Charges of fraud and mismanagement grew. Finally, on April 6, 1867, Carleton was removed from command of the New Mexico District. The Department of the Interior's Indian Service took control of the Bosque Redondo. Almost immediately, the Indian Service recommended the reservation be closed. The question now was what to do with the Navajos. Some wanted to return them to a small reservation that would be established in their old homeland. Others opposed that. One reason for removing the Navajo had been to allow white people to seek valuable minerals. Although no gold or silver had been discovered yet in Denata, no one knew what might be found in the future. So they suggested sending the Navajo people east to the Indian Territory in is now Oklahoma. Herrero had already stated that what the Navajos wanted. All the Navajos, he said, longed to return to the lofty mesas and red sand country. In April 1868, several Navajo headmen, including Manuelito and Barboncito, were brought to Washington to meet with Andrew Jackson. Note, they were planning on going to Washington, however, they did not go. They went to Santa Fe instead. It was decided that a peace commission would be sent to New Mexico to decide the future of the Navajo people. When the Navajo leaders returned to the Bosque, they held a sacred ceremony involving a coyote that was captured and then released in a circle of Navajos. Coyote is one of the Navajo holy people and holds a deeply sacred place in Navajo belief. The coyote walked slowly out of the circle, heading west towards Dinata. This was a sign that the people must go home. At the coyote ceremony, Borbencito, a deeply spiritual headman, was chosen as chief spokesman for all the Navajos still held in captivity at Fort Sumner. The Peace Commission was led by General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of the heroes for the North in the Civil War. Although he had a reputation as a ruthless warrior, Sherman was appalled at the suffering the Navajos had endured. I found the Bosque, he said, a mere spot of green in the midst of wild desert, and the Navajos sunk into a condition of absolute poverty and despair. Barboncito was eloquent and direct with the commission. When asked what the Navajos wanted, he responded, I hope to God that you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own. Further, he said, if we go back to our country, we will be willing to abide by whatever orders are issued to us. The next day, 10 headmen delegated by the Navajos signed what turned out to be the first fair treaty between their people and the United States government. Among them was Herrero, Barboncito, and Manuelito. The Navajos were finally going home. On June 18, 1868, a column of Navajos, 10 miles long, set out from Fort Sumner. With them were 50 supply wagons and 4 companies of cavalry. The people were filled with joy at the first sight of Mount Taylor, the easternmost of their sacred peaks, overwhelmed them. When we saw the top of the mountain from Albuquerque, we wondered if it was our mountain, and it felt like falling to the ground. We loved it so. One old woman was so moved that she exclaimed, Sacred Mountain, I am home, and then she died. From then on, it is said that the Navajos were careful not to let their elders catch sight of their sacred mountains too quickly for fear their hearts would fail. Fort Defiance, near Window Rock, Arizona, was the closest army post to the new reservation. It was set up as a headquarters for the Indian Service's Navajo agent and as a supply depot. It was not easy for the Navajos to rebuild their homes and start again. Their new reservation was very small, but they were home. In 1869, the government began to give them the livestock promised in the treaty, 30,000 sheep, 4,000 goats, purchased by the Indian Affairs Office from local ranches in Arizona and New Mexico. From that point on, the Navajo Nation grew. As the number of people and the sizes of the herds increased, the government enlarged the boundaries of the reservation through executive orders. By 1880, the original 3,328,000 acres had doubled. Finally, it covered a large part of the original homeland. Although the Dene and Nahe were not mentioned in the Treaty of 1868, they were allowed to return to their homes at Cañoncito in New Mexico, and eventually were granted lands now designated as the Cañoncito Navajo Reservation. 2 other separate Navajo reservation sites were established in New Mexico at Rama and Alamo. Although they are detached from the much larger main reservation, those 3 areas take part in Navajo tribal government. Today, more than 150,000 Navajos live on what has become the largest of all reservations in the United States. If you look down into Canyon de Chelly, you will see Navajo hogans again. They are at night beside the fire, and one of these hogans, an old man, tells his grandchildren a story of long ago. Perhaps it is a tale of creation or of one of the monsters that threaten the lives of the people. It is a story that speaks of the deep connection between the Dene and the sacred land. It is, like the history of the Long Walk, a tale of difficulty, of danger, and of survival that is inspiring to us all. Afterward, the Navajo people have kept their promise to live in peace with the United States. They have become known as the great herders of livestock and deeply gifted silver workers. The beautiful rugs woven by the Navajo women are prized all over the world. Though the Navajos never fought the United States again, their warrior spirit and the urge to defend their sacred land has remained strong. Volunteering to fight in the American armed forces has become a tradition followed by thousands of Navajos. In World War II, Navajo soldiers played an important role. The Japanese were monitoring American communication and had deciphered every American code. Navajo servicemen devised an unbreakable code based on their own language. Soon, Navajo code talkers were at the heart of the American Signal Corps, and their efforts contributed greatly to winning the War of the Pacific. The end. We hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you so much for listening.